Hello, welcome to Free Bible Commentary with Pastor Teacher Dr. Bob Utley. Be sure to visit Free Bible Commentary at www.freebiblecommentary.org. Now, here's Bob.
Deuteronomy 26. This is a very interesting chapter because it's going to deal with two things that are very, very confusing in Old Testament study. And that is the annual feast of the Old Testament and tithing in the Old Testament. Now you say, I believe both of them. Good. But the problem is, how do you sort out all of the ins and outs of all these different books? It is extremely confusing to try to get an overall picture of the annual feast, when they happen, what they're for, and the different tithes within Judaism. So we're going to try to do it tonight. Chapter 26 is the last chapter of these very specific, particular laws that we've been into since chapter 12. Can you believe it's been that long? These little, never mind. We've been in these little detailed laws about every little aspect of life. And we're going to be moving away from that now. This is the last kind of summary chapter before we move into a different kind of section in the book of Deuteronomy. Now, it's going to be dealing with two specific things. It's going to be dealing with the first fruits, and it's going to be dealing with the third year tithe, a triennial poor tithe. So let me get you to read verses 1 through 11 for me, okay, in your translation, and then we'll go back and deal with it phrase by phrase. Read Deuteronomy 26, 1 through 11. Okay. Best you can do, Harlan. What we have here is dealing with the first fruits. What are first fruits? What's that referring to? First fruits. Referring to the first ripened part of the agricultural crop. Be it figs, dates, barley, corn, grain, anything grown, the first fruits are the first ripened part of that. Now, notice it says in verse 1, when you enter the land, Moses is still on the plains of Moab, on the western side of the Jordan River, preparing the people to enter the land, not with him, but with Joshua. And then he talks about these first fruits. Now, first fruits are caught up in two agricultural feast days. The Feast of Weeks, which is in the spring, and the Feast of Booths, which is in the fall. And I'm going to wait and deal with those at the end and try to give you once and for all a systematic thing. You may want to put it in the front of your Bible to get this thing down once and for all. So every time it mentions these, you'll know when and where and what they're for, okay? So I'll be dealing with those in just a minute. Notice verse 2 where it says that you shall take some of the first of all the produce of the ground. It doesn't say how much. It's been a real question within the study of the Old Testament if the tithe and the first fruits are the same. I personally think the tithes and the first fruits are different. The first fruit was brought to God. Here it says in a basket. It doesn't say how much. It's brought to God as a symbol of God's ownership of the land, as a thanksgiving for what God has done for the Jewish nation to bring them to a land that's so fertile. It's a way of giving to God His due, that the rest of the crop might be common or clean to eat, okay? Until the first fruits is given, the whole crop is holy. And so it's that kind of thing. It's a voluntary thing. It's not mandatory how much. It's a voluntary thing. Notice where it says that you take it in the basket to the place where the Lord your God chooses to establish His name. Now, we've discussed the problem about some people think that Deuteronomy was written way, way later in the monarchical period, during the reform of Josiah, the young good king. I think that Deuteronomy was written by Moses. I have no problem with that. And I think Moses is saying wherever the central sanctuary is, and it was at several places during Israel's history. Jerusalem was not always the cultic center of worship. It was at Gilgal. It was at Shechem. It was at Shiloh before it was at Jerusalem. So wherever the Lord chose to have His name dwell, a central meeting place for all the tribes, to give them cohesiveness and unity is where God's talking about. Now, notice where it says in verse 4, the priest shall take the basket from your hand and set it before the altar. Now over in verse 10 it says that the man shall bring it and set it down before the Lord. And so people say, aha, contradiction in the Bible. Very obvious between verse 4 where the priest set it down and verse 10 where the man sets it down, or the bringer. Well, it's not a contradiction at all. It is simply the case that we don't have a detailed outline of the ritual. We don't know how many times they move that basket from the altar back to the bringer or to the priest. It just lists very succinctly what's happening. Sometime in this ceremony, probably, the priest would raise this offering either with the man in front or behind and wave it before the Lord. It was the way they did these kind of offerings. And that's not even mentioned here. But we know from the parts that was the common thing done for this kind of offering. So it's just not a detailed account. I don't think we have a contradiction at all in that. Notice where it says, verse 5 is very important for trying to determine the origins of the Hebraic people. This is kind of a dialogue or a ritual or a set liturgical formula for people bringing these first fruits to the Lord. Verse 5 through verse 10 is a set pattern that they said every time they brought it. Notice what they said. First of all, my father, now my translation was a wandering Armenian. Does yours have that? Who does not have that? Okay, what translation do you have, Marvin? What does King James have? A Syrian ready to perish. Okay? Somebody have something different than that? Yes, what translation? Okay. Or migrant Armenian. Okay. When it says my father, a wandering Armenian or a perishing Syrian or who is he talking about? Well, many would want to think Abraham, but if you read the next little phrase, it's got to be Jacob, doesn't it? Now, Jacob and Israel are the same person, right? His name was changed at the brook Jabbok when he wrestled with the angel from Jacob, which means usurper, to Israel, okay? Now, when it says a wandering, does your translation have a little arrow there that points to the margin? New American Standard does. I don't know if the other ones do or not. The word here is used many times in the Old Testament, and it's often used for perishing or destruction or ailing. It's sometimes used for a domestic animal that wanders away from the flock. So wandering is a secondary meaning. I think the best, if I had to translate it, I would translate perishing. You say, why perishing? Remember when Jacob went to Egypt, Jacob was a very, very old man. Famine had swept through Canaan. He had to go to Egypt, and he was just about to die even. He said, don't leave my bones down here, but take them back with you when you go. So I think perishing is probably a much better translation of the Hebrew word than wandering, although it could be wandering. Now, why would King James have Syrian and mine have Armenian? Have you ever heard of a place called Padan Aram? Padan Aram? Now, who lived there in the life of Jacob? Who lived in the Padan Aram area? That's where Laban was from. And Laban, of course, was the father of Jacob's two wives, Leah and Rachel. This area, Padan Aram, or Aram, is close to the city of Haran at the top of the Fertile Crescent that runs from Tigris-Euphrates River all the way up and down the coast of the Mediterranean. Modern-day Syria is why they get the translation of Syria. And so this, we find, is some of the racial beginnings of the Hebrew people. And you find that Genesis 25:20, Genesis 28:5 and 7. So Armenian background is possibly a very good background. We found many of the names of these people around the archaeological sites around Haran in this area. It seemed to imply that when God said to Abraham, leave your country and your kinsmen, he wasn't so much talking about Ur of the Chaldees, but he was talking about Haran, where they apparently lived a very long time. And Haran was where? Pterodine. Okay, and notice we continue this, and it says, went down to Egypt and sojourned there. The word sojourn is a word that means resident alien. Okay? They were few in number. Genesis 46:27 says they were how many in number? 70. When they went, they came out, I think about 1.5 million people. I don't think it came out 3 million. I think it's 600,000 fighting men, which doesn't include the women and children under the age of fighting age. I would say around 1.5 million. I think 3 million is way too big. Anyway, notice in verse 7 where it says, and we cried to the Lord. We'll skip it a little bit. The Lord heard our voice and saw our affliction. One of my favorite texts. I preached on one of my favorite texts the Wednesday night before I left. I told you about another one about David and the way he fought the bears and lions and fought Goliath. Another one of my very favorite ones is Exodus chapter 3, where in verse 7 it says, and God's talking to Moses, and God says, surely I have seen the afflictions of my people who are in Egypt, and I have given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters, for I am aware of their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the power of the Egyptians. And then down in verse 9 it says, I have seen the oppression with which the Egyptians are oppressing them, and behold, the cry of the sons of Israel has come to me. Well, I want to tell you, God saw and heard. And I want to tell you tonight that no matter what you're going through, and how lonesome you may feel in what you're going through, and how you feel like your prayers don't reach the ceiling, I want to tell you, God hears the prayers of His children. And God feels the stripes by which His children are burdened. And God, in His time and His will come to set them free. And so patience and faith are the keys in our living for God today. But I want you to know tonight, there's never a prayer you pray that God didn't hear and respond. And there's never a time that you hurt that God doesn't hurt with you. And so I think that's God did hear, and God did see, and thank God He did something about both of them. And then it says a little phrase here, it's very important in verse 7, it says, cried to the Lord, the God of our fathers. Now that phrase wouldn't hit you probably if you aren't familiar with Old Testament study. The patriarchs called God by several names. They called Him El Shaddai, God Almighty. They called Him El. They called Him Elohim. Several names like that. But they never called God by the covenant name until God revealed Himself to Moses in Exodus chapter 3. Exodus chapter 3 is the first time God ever told anybody what His covenant name was. It's from the Hebrew word to be, Yada, and we translate it probably, we don't know for sure, probably it's vocalized, Yahweh. And what the phrase says is, you notice the word the Lord is in all capital letters in your Bible? Whenever the word Lord is in all capital letters, it means Yahweh. Whenever it's just the L is capitalized, but the other ones are small, it means Adonai, which is just the word for Lord or Master. So what it's saying is, the Yahweh and the God of the patriarchs are the very same God. So it was not a strange God that met Moses that burning bush. It was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but who revealed to him His true name. But if you'd ask Abraham, who is Yahweh, Abraham would have said, I don't know. They did not know that name or know God by that name. Now, notice in verse 8 where it says, brought you out of Egypt with a mighty hand, with an outstretched arm. Does God have an arm? It's a metaphor for what? Power, deliverance, victory. God is spirit. But when you speak of a man's right arm, it speaks about power to do what He wants to do. And that's where it's spoken about God. Every time the word arm or power is used in the Old Testament, it speaks of God's might, God's power. Notice where it says, where it's with great terror and signs and wonders. What's that talking about? What is that talking about? The plagues. The plagues. And I'll bring them to this place and give us a land flowing with milk and honey. And the same thing's done in verse 15. Is a land flowing with milk and honey a description of the land or a designation for the land? And I told you a while back, it's both, really. But in archaeological discoveries, we have found the land of Canaan not described as a rich land, but called a land flowing with milk and honey. It's just like saying Iran today, or Turkey, or Egypt. Palestine was called the land flowing with milk and honey. That was its name. Now, it describes somewhat the kind of land it was, but it was a designation for the area. Now, notice in verse 10 where it says, and now behold, I have brought the first of the produce of the ground, which thou, O Lord, hast given me. That's nothing more than a true perspective. You know, man's a very ingenious animal. God's given him a wonderful brain. Much that we see in our society and in our world is simply humanity organized apart from God. And man has great potential in his mind, and he has great possibility for art in his hands. But the man that realizes that all things come from God is the man who has the true knowledge of reality. When your life is controlled by the perspective of the givenness of God, life becomes a joy. And so I think if this man bowed down with his few little figs or his few little grapes or his few little grains of barley and simply said, "Oh God, this is from my land, and I have sweated to get these, but I want you to know, God, I know that you're the one that gave them to me." I think also it's in contradistinction from the fact that it wasn't Baal, the fertility gods, that caused this land to be fertile, but it was our God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Yahweh. Now, notice where it says the word worship in verse 10. The word worship in Hebrew is the word for to prostrate oneself before, to worship. And so they translate the word worship, but it's the other word here. Verse 11, you and the Levite and the alien who is among you shall rejoice in all the good which the Lord your God has given you and your household. How about that? David, here's oikos theology in the Old Testament. The rabbis took this, and today we were in Israel on a high holy day, a special day. We were at what's now called Pentecost. It's called the festival of Shavuot today. The Old Testament was the festival of weeks. It's a 50 days past Passover. And it is a special time of bringing the fruit, the produce of the land, to the priest. Involved in this through the years has become not just an agricultural day, but a thanking God for the giving of the law. Now the rabbis get this from verses like verse 11, which says all good things come from God. And then down in verse 15, in a rabbinical way that you and I can't even see there, they also get the idea that God has given the law from verse 15 and verse 11. So it's rabbinical hermeneutics, which are sometimes very foreign to us in the way we think. But that's the concept of having the agricultural day and the giving of the law together. I want you to notice the idea of rejoice. I get very upset with us at Baptists sometimes, and with us as Christians in general, for this reason. We make our faith so somber. We feel like that quietness and solemnness is reverence. We feel like that you're not holy if you're laughing or talking. I want to tell you, the festival days of the Old Testament are festivals. There is dance, there is song, there is laughter in the streets. There is a joyous spirit of God and man together. The only fast day in all the Old Testament is the one day, the Day of Atonement. The rest were parties, friends. God and man were meeting together. God had blessed the land. There was increase. The women were fruitful. The vines were flowing. And the people rejoiced in the presence of God. I feel like we've lost some of that joy in God's presence. I really do. I feel like we've made such a tight little box out of our faith that somehow joy doesn't fit in our categories of what's right and wrong. Well, I want to tell you, joy fits in God's category. Thanks be unto Him. Now, verse 12 and following are going to deal with the tithes. But before we come to the tithe, let me deal with this yearly festival chart. If you'll turn to a blank page in your Bible somewhere, If you don't have a blank page, maybe you can find a place in the Pentateuch somewhere. And I want to try to give you this as simply as I can, because this has been so confusing to me. It took me 5 hours today just to sort this out for myself. Now, if it took me 5 hours with all my study in the Old Testament, I can imagine what it does to somebody who's trying to read through it, and just gets so confusing. So let me give you the main days, when they are, what they're for, what they're called, okay? There's not going to be very many feast days. Now, these are yearly feast days. These are Moses' feast days, okay? The Jews today have more than this because they have some added ones. But first of all, the first month of the year, it's called Nisan. It goes by other names, but Nisan is close enough, Nisan. On the first month, on the 14th day at twilight. Now, the Jewish day begins when? 6 in the morning? 6 at night. Okay, twilight. This is the Passover feast. It was a one-day feast. Passover is one day only. It is followed the next day, first month, Nisan, 15th day, by the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now that lasts 7 days. And so you can see we have an 8-day festival here, a rejoicing festival. This is the time that the first barley fruit is given to God. Nothing else is ripe. It's too early. But this is when the barley is ripe, and they give the barley first fruits at this feast. 50 days later, 7 Sabbaths after Passover, comes the Feast of Weeks. It's called Pentecost. That comes from the Greek word for 50th, Penta. And so we call it Pentecost in the New Testament, but the Old Testament thing is the Feast of Weeks. It lasts only one day. One day. And on this day, the rest of the first fruits are brought. And possibly even the tithe, one of the tithes then. Okay, now those are the spring festivals. Spring. Now we're moving toward the fall. The 7th month, Tishri, T-I-S-R-I. 7th month, first day, is the blowing of trumpets. Now this is it's a festival day to get the folks ready for harvesting. Harvesting's beginning now, okay? And then on the 10th day of that month is the Day of Atonement. Leviticus chapter 16, so that's talked about. That is the great day of fasting, the only day of fasting in all the Old Testament, where the whole nation fasts for sins of ignorance and that the community may have done. This is where the scapegoat is and all of that. Now, on the 15th day of that same month, the 7th month, Tishri, the Feast of Booths. It's often called the Feast of Tabernacles. This is where the Jews build booths out of the palm tree limbs. Okay, it's the fall agricultural harvest festival. It lasts for 7 days. It's agricultural ingathering. The tithes are given, and Numbers 29, 12 through 39 are a very appropriate time for that. The Feast of Weeks, if you want a scriptural deal, would be Deuteronomy 26, 1 through 10, our text for tonight. So those are the basic feast days, and I think that'll help you get a perspective when they're talking about these different feast days. Their spring feast and their fall feast. Now, verse 12 down through 15 is talking about the tithe. And this is a very special tithe. This is called the tithe of your increase in the 3rd year. Judaism calls it the poor tithe. Now, I've listed under number 4, tithes in Judaism. The rabbis list 3 tithes, and I want to show you why they do it and where they get it. They list, first of all, the agricultural tithes and the tithes of the firstborn for the priest. Remember, the priest got some of the offerings, the animal offerings. They got the part of the tithe. They got part of the first fruits. Now, this is considered the first tithe in Judaism that has to be done every year. The second tithe is called that in Judaism, the second tithe. It comes from Deuteronomy 14, verses 22 through 27, and it was the tithe that a man brought to the sanctuary to have a communion meal with his friends, families, and the Levites and the strangers and the orphans and the widows that he brought with him. It's a communion meal, what it is. And third, it called the poor tithe that we found here in this chapter, Deuteronomy 26, verses 12 through 15, is every 3 years it's given to the Levites, who are not the priests now, but just the Levites who are in the towns, and the widows, and the strangers, and the poor, and the orphans. Now, Judaism lists these 3 tithes and teaches them. It says on the 3rd year that a man is to leave off the 2nd tithe and to do the tithe for the poor. But this first tithe is always in effect for Judaism. Why would that be, do you think? Well, it'd be like cutting your own salary to say every 3 years you don't have to give a tithe for the support of the priest. I don't think there's 3 tithes in the Old Testament. I think there's 1. In my opinion, what they've done is taken these verses, and because they can't get them to fit together the way they would like to, they just make 3 of them where it fits real well. If you have 3 scriptures and you can't seem to get them to fit, you just make 3 different occasions. I think what happened is that the first fruits is different from the tithes. The first fruits belong to the priest always. The tithe, I think, was large enough that the priest had his portion, the offerer had his portion to eat with his family, and then every 3rd year he left off entirely the priest and his own portion, and he gave to the poor every 3 years. I think there was always 1 tithe, and it was divided among the priest and the offerer for 2 years, and the 3rd year it was all given to the poor in the local towns to be distributed by the guy who grew it himself. He would pass out the food himself to the poor the 3rd year. And then, as you'll see, he was to appear before God to testify that he had given all of his poor tithe to the poor. I know that's confusing to you, but simply to say, the Old Testament study in these matters are very difficult because there's different periods. It was done different in the Pentateuch than it was done in the Judges, than it was done in the early monarchy, that it was done in the later monarchy, and it gets very confusing. But simply to say, I think there's 1 tithe instead of 3. That's encouraging, right? Now, notice verse 12 where it says, when you have finished paying all the tithe of your increase in the 3rd year, you can see Deuteronomy 14, 28 and 29, it says this same thing about this tithe for the poor. The year of tithing, then you shall give to the Levite, to the stranger, to the orphan, to the widow, that they may eat in your towns and be satisfied. The Jews were so meticulous that they said, well, now you can't give them just a little bit. You've got to give them enough, and they'd give you an amount that they would be satisfied. The Bible says satisfied. You can't give them 1 McDonald's small hamburger and they'd be satisfied. No, you got to give them a Big Mac or something, you see. Enough for them to be full and satiated with it, you know. Now, verse 13. And you shall say before the Lord your God. Now, this implies that every man who grows these things and gives them out every 3rd year to the poor has to travel himself to the central sanctuary, be it at Gilgal, be it at Shiloh, be it at Shechem, be it at Jerusalem. He has to go and say these words before the Lord, a kind of a pledge or a binding thing or a promise. This is what he says. I have removed the sacred portion from my house, and also have given it to the Levite, the alien, the orphan, the widow, according to all thy commandments which thou hast commanded me. I have not transgressed or forgotten any of thy commandments. Now, the word sacred portion up here in verse 13 is the word holy. And Leviticus 27:30 says, the tithe to the Lord is holy. That means set apart for his use. It can't be given to anybody but the priest. And notice what it says here in verse 14. This is still his quote now. He says to the Lord, I have not eaten of it while mourning, nor have I removed any of it while I was unclean, nor offered any of it to the dead. What in the world is all this talking about? It seems to be caught up in this fertility worship of Baal that the Canaanites practiced before the Hebrew children came into the land. Many times you may have noticed in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy it says, do not cut yourself for the dead. Do not tattoo yourself for the dead. Do not shave your head for the dead. Don't get into this worship of ancestors, this worship of spirits. This idea about mourning can possibly be, don't get into mourning the dead for spiritual purposes. Now, Jeremiah 16, verses 5 through 7, deal with some of these cultural aspects of their worshiping of spirits, animism, that continued even during Jeremiah's time. So it's hard to know exactly what this is talking about when it says morning. This word morning is really the Hebrew word for nothing or vanity, it's often translated. It's translated a bunch of ways, but it is always associated with idolatry. So what we have here is some regulation against idolatry. Nor have I removed any of it while I was unclean. Now, let me use some other Bible translations of this little phrase. It's kind of confusing in Hebrew. The Jerusalem Bible says, I have consumed nothing that was unclean. The Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, says, for an unclean purpose I have not done this. A good parallel passage might be Haggai chapter 2, verse 13. And a good parallel passage for the idea about mourning for the dead might be Hosea chapter 9, verse 4. Now the last little thing, which talks about offered any of it to the dead, Lamsa, which is the modern translator of the Peshitta, which is the Aramaic translation of the Old and New Testament, says that there is a tradition where after a funeral, somebody cooks dinner for all the relatives that are there. Now it's something like we do when we have death in the church. We take a meal to the people who have had a loved one die because they have loved ones coming in, and we provide a meal most of the time for them. Well, in the Old Testament, that was a sign of idolatry. And the idea about taking this portion given for the poor and spending it for a big party after the funeral, he's saying, I haven't done that. So exactly what these are, we don't know, but they're caught up in some kind of fertility worship or ancestor worship, and he's saying, I haven't been involved in these kinds of things. Now, verse 15, look down from thy holy habitation from heaven and bless thy people Israel. Notice that even they realized that God was transcendent. God had not lived among them since when? Since they griped and bickered over the quail. And God said, I am so mad at you, if I stayed here, I'd kill you. So I'm going to send my angel before you, and you better listen to him, because he's got the same kind of power I do. But God did not dwell with his people anymore after that. And even when God came down in Solomon's temple, he went right back up. And when God came down and talked to Moses, he went right back up. God did not dwell with his people anymore. Matter of fact, one of the promises of the book of Revelation is that God will be with his people. He's not now in this Old Testament sense. He will be then, which means he dwells in their midst. Now, the Ark of the Covenant was a sign of that dwelling. The temple was a sign of that dwelling, but he did not dwell there. So when it talks about the fact that you hear from heaven, it's saying that you live in heaven. Now, whether the word's plural, always in Hebrew, the word for heaven's plural, but the word for face is plural, so that doesn't help us any. It's just saying God is off, other, different, apart. But even though he's apart and other and different, he hears our prayers and makes our land produce. And I think that's very important. Notice in verse 16, down to the end, is a summary conclusion to all these specific laws that have gone on before. Now we're coming to an end of this very detailed, specific legislation, and verse 16 through 19 is a summary of that. Notice where it talks about the word, you see the verb declare in verse 17 and 18? This is the only place that this word appears in what's called a hithel stem, which is a certain kind of grammatical way of talking about verb tenses. The Septuagint calls this word chosen. But really it has a causative idea in Hebrew, and some translations say that you have caused God to call you his people, and God has caused you to call him your God. I really don't know, but it's a very rare word, a very solemn word, talking about the chosenness of the Hebrew people. Notice in verse 18 where it talks about you are a treasured possession. This is a word not used very often. It's used in Exodus 19:5. It's used in Deuteronomy 7:6 and Deuteronomy 14:2. It's often translated, you are a peculiar people, is the usual English translation. It means a special prized possession. Why did God choose the Jew? Deuteronomy and other places seems to imply he chose them because of their weakness and because of their stubbornness. They were a stiff-necked, rebellious, slave people. But God wanted to show the marvelousness of His grace. And by choosing them and delivering them and continuing to bless them, He shows the kind of God that He is. And they are special in the sense of being God's chosen instrument to the world to show that God keeps His word. Now notice, if you would, the last part. It says a consecrated people in verse 19. That's the word holy. The word holy means set apart for God's service. Many people find great problems in this chapter because in this summary of the verses 5 through 10 that the Sinai is not mentioned. And they say, see, Sinai is a separate tradition. I think here we have an agricultural blessing for the land, and the idea of the covenant just does not appear there. And I don't think it's a problem of a different source. I just think it's a problem of different emphasis, which I think is very important. Okay, I'm glad I got through with that. Questions, comments? Who can name me the feast days without looking? What's the major spring festival? The major spring festival. Feast of Weeks. What's the major fall festival? Booths or tabernacles? Okay, good. Okay, good. Any questions or comments? All right, I think Deuteronomy is going to change course now, and we'll get into a different kind of section. And the rest of these are going to be some very theological, very overshadowing. I think we're going to really enjoy this last section. We're almost through Deuteronomy now. We only got to 30-something chapters, so we got, 7, 8 more weeks in Deuteronomy. And I hope that you followed through this. If you have followed through Deuteronomy, when you read back through Genesis, through Numbers, it's going to have great meaning to you. Where it's very confusing before, you'll start seeing. Because Deuteronomy is a re-preaching through the whole of Mosaic legislation. And I hope it'll begin to sparkle with some light for you.